Assalamu alaikum, welcome to Muslims for Progressive Values. I'm your host, Kendra Cordova, and today we have another exciting installment of the Progressive Islamic curriculum from Muslims for Progressive Values. Shouting out to the ANA Foundation for making that possible for us. Today we're going over Unit 4, Lessons 1 and 2, and this is going to be over reading the Quran as a progressive Muslim. The two topics we're going to be talking about today are actually going to be hijab and some women's rights stuff in there. And then we are also going to be talking about LGBTQ people, specifically gay people, the story of Lut in Islam. I've done videos on both of these topics already, so there might be little parts that I maybe don't go in some of my own research depth as I do in those other videos. So after the class later this week, or if you're watching on YouTube afterwards, also go check those ones out. I have ones on hijab, modesty, uh, the story of the Prophet Lut, homosexuality, all that stuff. So let's go ahead and get started. You will notice as we go through today for all of those, we're going to have multiple scholars who are going to have like different ways of approaching these different topics from a progressive viewpoint. That is because, especially in like progressive Islam, we do not believe that there's just one right answer. Instead, as I've talked about in previous classes, we are going to anchor into our core values and our core beliefs, right? So if we believe as Muslims that justice, truth, compassion and mercy, forgiveness, all of that stuff is a core theme in Islam, is a core theme throughout the Quran. We take that with us as we go through these scholarly interpretations. So keep that in mind as well. So lesson 1 here is going to be gender equality in the Quran. So this is a topic that, as I said earlier, is kind of considered like controversial. And that is because of the like wide range within the Islamic community of interpretations on this. You add that to like the constant, negative press, especially in the West, that is covered about Islam. So you're going to hear things like, women's rights or feminism or any of those other things are not conducive with, an Islamic lifestyle or whatever that is, or faith. And we're going to talk about how that is inaccurate here. So, before I start on these direct quotes from these scholars, I did make a note. I made a previous video on modesty and hijab, and I want to put some of those facts up front before we get started so that we all have like the mindset of we don't need to get into these sort of like basic arguments. We're going to get into more of like a scholarly interpretation, like more in depth on these. So before we can get there, I want to let you guys know some of these things we need to understand as we go in. So in my previous video on hijab, I had talked about Omar Anchasi's status distinctions and sartorial differences, slavery, sexual ethics, and the social logic of veiling in Islamic law. So this is a scholarly piece. It is kind of like heavy on the jargon, but if you're looking into trying to understand Islamic law as it pertains to veiling, modesty, modest dress, etc., that's a great piece to go check out. The two things that people are going to come up as we go into this topic that you hear constantly from within the Muslim community and without as well is the idea that, if a woman is wearing a certain outfit, then she's basically like asking for it, or if something happens to her, you hear like, well, what was she wearing? She shouldn't have been out late. She shouldn't have. There's a lot of like this victim blaming. So I wanted to look into like the psychology and the statistics behind those sorts of things so that we can sort of like understand the truth behind or the false uh, false claims here behind those different things. So the first thing is that does revealing clothing increase things like catcalling? The studies show that that is true. Okay, so if you are wearing like a super tight V-neck bikini thing going on, um, does that sometimes increase the chance of being noticed, whistled at, flirted at, any of that stuff? That does happen more prominently with specific outfits. However, it is extremely important to understand that SA, like assaults, okay, are not the same thing as being annoyed and harassed and catcalled. Those are two completely different mentalities, events for the people involved. So there are some videos where you can see some Muslims that are making this point where they'll have a woman with a camera walk around a city like New York or another city wearing two different outfits to see the treatment that she gets. And, oftentimes they'll say, well, if you notice, there's less catcalling when she dresses more modestly. Therefore, modest dress is protecting women from assault. However, if you go into the actual like international and national statistics on this stuff, things like the Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology or the National Institute of Justice, you're going to see that that is not what that shows, right? So uh, those different sources note that dress is not an indicator or factor in the chance of sexual assault, that most assailants don't actually remember what the person was wearing who they assaulted. 85 to 90% of SAs are usually by someone that they know. And 76% of murders, right? Because sexual assault and violent acts go hand in hand here, right? And so those also 76% of those were by either the intimate partner or a family member. So oftentimes you'll also hear that, well, we should cover around people we don't know to protect the women, but she can stay uncovered around her mehrams, right? Like her family members. Statistics throughout history and throughout the world and every culture show that a woman is in the most danger from that kind of assault from family members, close relatives, people that are there to care for them, not a random person on the street. So I wanted to put that out there before we start talking about this, that we're not talking about um, chance of assaults. That's not what we're going to talk about here. And if somebody does come up and say that, wearing modest clothes or forcing somebody to wear certain clothes is to try to protect them from an assault, that's just inaccurate. So let's take a look at some of the Quran verses and how some of these scholars, these progressive scholars, have interpreted them through the use of the hermeneutics that we talked about previously and what's going on there. So the first one is going to be commonly cited is Quran 33:59. O Prophet, tell your wives, your daughters, and the wives of those who acknowledge that they should lengthen upon themselves their outer garments. That is better so that they would not be recognized and not be harmed. God is forgiver, most compassionate. So they cover because it's a sin if they don't? No. We're talking about covering, and then we're talking about this sort of like annoyance, harassment stuff we were just talking about, right? Now we're going to take a look at the historical context and how that was broken down as well. So Asma Lamrabet, she's a prominent progressive scholar. Her analysis of verse 33:59, it's talking about jilbab here. Now, again, in my previous video, we talked about how the word hijab is not actually used in any of these quotes that we're going to talk about in the Quran. Nowadays, when people say hijab, they're usually referring to like the headscarf, but originally that's not what the word hijab was used for. We're going to cover that later as well. So jilbab is going to be the word that was used there. Something that is put over clothes is going to be the more common definition there. This is like an overcoat or a cape of sorts. It's an outer garment. So this is often cited, by people who think that wearing a headscarf is mandatory. However, again, the word here is jilbab, which is an outer covering. So scholars of the Quran, both traditional and progressive, believe that this verse was revealed in the aftermath of an event that took place one evening when a group of young women were on their way home from praying at the mosque. So as they were walking home, they were harassed by a group of young men in the alleyways or in the like dark streets. So, because this verse was revealed after this event, scholars of Islam interpret this verse as advising all Muslim women to cover themselves to be protected against harassment, because covering themselves would distinguish them as believing women rather than enslaved women. Now, again, I talked about that in my previous video as well, which is that it wasn't to protect women, all women, right? Because you'll often hear that, like, there's so much respect for women, we want to protect the women. It was to distinguish the Muslim free women from the enslaved women because slavery was still a thing, sex slaves were still a thing. And so this covering was meant to let people know that you were in a different class. So Lambervet rejects the central component of this interpretation that it applies exclusively to free and believing women because it is inconsistent with the spiritual message of social justice in Islam. For her, it is impossible to accept that the Quran would prefer some women over others, especially when the Quran calls for the liberation of slaves, right? So now she's like, okay, well, as we come to this, if that is the traditional way that people have looked at it, and we believe that the Quran is here as a liberation theology, as a liberating document, what can we do about that? So she believes that the verse does not seek to establish a way to distinguish between free women and slave women, so she disagrees with that interpretation. She says that instead it sought to protect women from harassment without preventing them from practicing their religious freedom and praying at the mosque at night. She does identify that this verse is circumstantial, meant for women who are traveling unaccompanied in the evening in this specific social context, and therefore cannot be considered to have a universal application in today's world. So this specific scholar says she doesn't believe that it was to separate those two classes, but that instead was the contextual for women traveling alone at night, going to mosques, right? And so it's not like a universal 24/7 all the time requirement according to her interpretations here. Let's look at another scholar for this. So Asma Barlas. Asma Barlas also uses the historical contextualization method covered in the previous unit for 3359 of the Quran. So she translates jilbab as a cloak as well. It's to protect Muslim women from jahili, which is the non-Muslim men. So not just for Muslim women, but also specifically as a sign to non-Muslim men. The jilbab, according to Barlas, denoted that these women were under male protection because of the Islamic legal systems and therefore not, quote, fair game, unlike the slave women who had no male guardians. So again, one of the interpretations when people are trying to do this is the understanding of the class system here at the time, taking historical context. Here, they're saying that this was like a sign and signal that is like, hey, free woman, not in this certain class or view in society. Maintaining the jilbab in public spaces was an acknowledgement of the social context of the time, where sexual violence was rampant in the slave-owning society. For Barlas, though, this was also a marker of the men's sexual promiscuity, in which slave women were often the primary target. Although Barlas views this verse as a mandate, she believes it is not relevant today because the socio-historical context today is different from the context in which the verse was revealed, and because the verse is addressed to the Prophet Muhammad alone, therefore it is not a universal mandate that Muslim men could enforce. So, according to this scholar's interpretation, that it was a part of this class system. However, she points out that we don't have that same class system or historical context anymore, so it doesn't really make sense to do that, right? Because I don't need to, thank goodness, right? Alhamdulillah, I don't, there's no going outside and having to navigate this world of like the sexual violence and enslaved women and all of this stuff, thank goodness. But that since that was the context it was in, again, tomato of wisdom, right? Does it make sense to do it right now? No, it doesn't. We're not living in that same society. So that is her interpretation there. Let's look at their interpretations on 3353. So Quran 33:53, which says, O you who acknowledge, do not enter the Prophet's homes except if you are invited to a meal without you forcing such an invitation. But if you are invited, you may enter. When you finish eating, you shall leave without staying to wait for a hadith. This used to annoy the Prophet, uh, and he was shy to tell you, but God does not shy away from the truth. If you ask his wives for something, ask them from behind a barrier. This is pure for your hearts and their hearts. It is not for you to harm God's messenger, nor you should marry his wives after him. This is a gross offense with God. So, this verse section here always kind of makes me smile because in the modern context, this is like basically talking about like, like the people that interview like red carpet people or famous people and like the paparazzi that are always going to the people in LA. And you see like famous people outside wearing like no makeup and like a hoodie and sunglasses, and they're just trying to like buy a sandwich. That is very much sort of what was going on in this context here we're going to see. So Asma Lamrabet, the first scholar that we looked at, Lamrabet interprets this once again with consideration to the historical context in which this verse was revealed. It was revealed in the aftermath of the Prophet's marriage to Zainab, when a number of people attended the wedding at the Prophet's house. After the ceremony, three male guests stayed late in the night, debating with one another in the home of the newlyweds. The Prophet, too embarrassed to ask them to leave, stayed with them for the entire night alongside his new bride. So this context indicates that it was there to teach believers to respect the privacy of the Prophet, who had a special status as the messenger of God, and also that his wives having the special status of the mothers of the believers. So people were very excited to talk about all of this stuff to the point that they were being extremely intrusive, right? And so understanding that we need to respect people's boundaries is kind of what's going on here. However, Lambervet points out that this verse is not a universal one because it is concerned only with the wives of the prophet to ensure that they had a private life despite being very public figures in a community, right? So some people will use this verse now and say, oh, well, people needed to have a barrier between them and the prophet's wives. And since the prophet's wives were supposed to be like exemplar, so now we can say that women should always be behind a barrier if we're going to talk to them. And this is where you get into some of that like extreme, like modesty. Women cannot be seen, women cannot be heard, crazy, dark interpretations of this kind of stuff. It specifically is talking to this very specific context, very specific people. This is not universal. So there's also a little section here where it talks about how should we translate hijab into English. Lamrabet's reading of the Quran, hijab is not a form of Islamic dress or even modesty. Again, hijab is not used as an outfit choice or an outfit religious expression through clothing within the Quran. Instead, Lamrabet interprets hijab as it is used in the Quran, which is a symbol of separation or barrier between the public and private lives of the Prophet and his wives. So it talks about a barrier, right? Like a veil between like the pure and the impure, or the internal and the external, and there it's being used specifically about the wives of the Prophet, but again, that's not a universal context. Fatima Mernisi, who is another one of the prominent progressive scholars, Fatima says that she defines hijab as a curtain that is placed between two men, not between a man and a woman, which is the common definition. Renesi supports the interpretation by referring to instances when the Prophet drew a curtain or established a barrier between him and his male companions so that he could have private time with his wives. So again, with the context going on, a lot of people sharing space, right? And so this barrier was also put not just between like the men out here and then like the women over here, but the Prophet himself with his wives being like, okay, I need like to be alone with my family right now, putting that up. Like Lermorbet, Mernisi also considers the historical context. During this time, the Muslim community had suffered from a lack of confidence in the Prophet. As a result, there was a rise in hypocritical attacks on the Prophet in an effort to stir unrest in his household. This revelation has been seen to provide comfort to the female elite of the Muslim community at the time while protecting them from the invasion of privacy that was there to sow this unrest and like distrust in their personal lives. So again, this is very much like the famous people of nowadays, right? Where everybody's like up in their business 24/7, anytime they go to do anything and starting rumors about this person was talking to that person. And so this idea of a barrier was also to create like a sacred space and a safe, uh, like spiritual space to exist in without all of that noise of like the drama that's going on. Let's also look at Quran 434. So it says, the men are to support the women by what God has gifted them over one another and for what they spend of their money. The reformed women are devotees and protectors of privacy of what God has protected. As for those women from whom you fear disloyalty, then you shall advise them, abandon them in their bedchamber and separate them. If they obey you, then do not seek a way over them. God is high, most great. So this this verse, we all know it, 434. This is the one that is pointed to by non-Muslims and more conservative Muslims that causes a stir within the Muslim community that is it or is it not okay to beat your wife? This is that verse. It's kind of silly that we even need to talk about this, honestly, because obviously it's not okay to beat your wife. And if you're looking for an excuse in the Quran to beat your wife, you need help. You need to go talk to somebody about that because that is not okay. But let's take a look at why that happened and what's going on with the word there. That is often translated there. So on the next section, I'm going to go over some of the definitions of those words. But first, let's take a look at Amina Wadud. I've talked about Amina Wadud's work in previous videos as well. So Amina Wadud has perhaps one of the most extensive interpretations of the verse based on our own translations. She uses the hermeneutical principles that we talked about, specifically intratextuality and historical context here. So her general understanding of the verse is one that does not condone violence against women, is derived from her extraction of the general principles of the Quran based on the intratextual reading, which seeks to eliminate violence entirely. Again, so if we see the Quran as a liberation theology, if we see it as one that focuses on mercy, if we see it as one that focuses on having the most peace, right? Like Allah loves those who enjoy in peace, right? All of that throughout the Quran, it would not make sense here. Obviously, like that's why people get so confused when this comes up because it's like, how could that happen? How could this be a liberation theology? And it says like to hit your wife. That doesn't make any sense. Okay. So let's see. Yeah. There are three vocab words here that I want to go over. So the first one is kanita. So Wadu translates kanita as to describe a good woman rather than an obedient woman. So supporting this translation by noting that throughout the Quran, qanitat is used to describe both men and women. Therefore, we can understand it to be a personality trait of the believers of God, right? So if we're talking about an obedient woman, then we need to equally say when we see that word in context with other people, an obedient man. And now everybody's going to start squirming when they hear that, right? Yeah. So let's take a look at when there's a word and it is repeated multiple times, we need to look at how it is used every time. How does that context change and how can we best understand what was meant there? So the next one, nushuz. So similar to Qanita Wadud draws attention to the fact that throughout the Quran, the term nushuz is often used to describe both men and women and can therefore not simply be interpreted uh, as disobedience of a wife towards a husband. Rather, Wadud understands that the term is there as a state of disorder between a married couple. So keeping that in mind, let's take a look at that one word, daraba. So daraba is the one that is always like kind of argued over, like what does it mean in this context? Because it's one of those words that has multiple meanings. However, it is in the Quran 58 times. So that word is there a lot. And not just that word, but like 58 times if you include like any variations of that word or words that use the same roots within the Quran. And the words that use the same roots tend to have like a similar like meaning, like a similar energy or point or topic going on there. So Daraba presents the biggest challenge for individuals seeking to understand this verse because it can be interpreted in a variety of ways. As I said, it has been interpreted as strike or hit. Now, this is going to be when you get those translations when people are like, and if none of that stuff works, hit your wife or strike your wife. And everybody goes, what? So this contributes to the misconception that Islam condemns domestic violence and permits spousal abuse. However, through an intratextual reading of the Quran, Wadud points out the fact that daraba is actually used in a variety of ways throughout the Quran. So again, we need to understand how it's being used here. Oftentimes, this is going to be used as separate, to separate or disconnect from. Here's two examples of other verses where it is used. So 1424, have you not seen how God cites the example of a good word is like a good tree, whose root is firm and its branches in the sky? So that can be to give an example. That is like the meaning there, to give an example of, or make an example of. And then Quran 494 can also be to travel, to disconnect, to go abroad. Here, oh, you who acknowledge, if you mobilize in the cause of God, then make a clear declaration and do not say to those who greet you with peace, you are not an acknowledger. So again, to disconnect. So if you take that into context and that it's used in those ways as well, you could also say that it means to separate here, right? To take time apart. You've probably heard that from people that are in relationships that have been having like a really hard time and a lot of fighting, right? Like we need to take some time, or like we're separated right now to fix ourselves and come back, whatever that is. So these other uses of daraba in the Quran indicate that Wadud believes that this final option provided in the Quran for couples experiencing disharmony in their marriage encourages individuals to take space from one another. Okay, so take space. So if none of this stuff is working and you guys are still having trouble, separate. All right, then let's also look at Quran 4, verses 2 through 3. So give the orphans their money, do not replace the good with the bad, and do not consume their money to your money, for truly it is a great sin. If you fear that you cannot be just to fatherless orphans, then marry those whom you see fit from the women 2 and 3 and 4. But if you fear you will not be fair, then only one, or whom you already have a contract with, so that you do not commit injustice and suffer hardship. So this is the line of polygamy. Now, a lot of context again that we're going to go through. But there are like the biological standpoints and like the sociological standpoints. There's the historical context. There's going to be the context here about like protection of wealth, especially for like those who are either poor or orphaned, and the uses of that. And then I want to give a little of my own sort of feedback here at the end of this section. So Osmo Barlas, who we just talked about previously, Barlas identifies three aspects to consider when interpreting this verse. She notes that she believes that it is limited to orphaned individuals who are of marrying age. So if someone doesn't have a family there to protect them legally, financially, meant to achieve justice for them and their inheritance. So again, these are people, when we talk about liberation theology, these are going to be people who traditionally, and even in our society today, I don't even know why I'm saying traditionally. I mean, you walk outside, see people who like are homeless and have no family to go to and all of that. That's just a thing. I don't even have to say traditionally for that. People who throughout society and throughout history have been victims of social injustice from economic and just life in general, right? Um, a good example of people who end up in these sorts of situations, even in the modern age, right? I was early in college, I worked in the medical field as an EMT and in hospitals for like the ICUs, like really like intense medical stuff. And there's a lady during one of my night shifts that came in and she was there. She had had an early like preterm labor and it ended up being very dangerous for her. So she had a premature birth and we didn't I lived in the middle of nowhere, so like the hospitals there weren't fantastic. So they ended up having to actually fly the baby to another hospital for the NICU stuff. And she was unconscious and like fighting for her own life here at our hospital. And it's like the middle of the night, and her room is empty. Nobody came. And I was talking to the nurse and I was like, what happened? Like, where's her family? And they were like, the guy walked out and she doesn't have family. So like this kind of stuff happens all the time. People will be in a position where they do not have the resources or the social net around them. And so this line here is talking about those people. It also says that men who practice polygamy uh, can rarely, almost never, be equally just to all of their wives, right? You're one person. And so having multiple wives, anybody who's been married, anybody that's been in any kind of relationship ever in the history of the world can tell you that having one relationship is a lot of work and time and effort. Uh, Again, in a good way, but it's not easy. And the idea of having to have multiple of those at the same time gets tricky. I do have again some like personal stuff to add to the end of this on that, but take that into consideration too. It even says it right there in the verse, right? It's like you are gonna have trouble. If you don't think that you can handle more than one, please don't have more than one. One is fine. It says it in the Quran, like don't bother. Because then it's a sin on you. Like if you're like, hey, I'm gonna like take care of and provide for all of these people, and I've made them all very unhappy and I'm ruining their lives, and none of them feel loved, or I'm not able to give the time that is needed for them, right? Like that sin is on you because you're the one who is supposed to be the provider and the one that's there, right? If you are in that situation socioeconomically. So Barlas highlights the fact that the Quran speaks of polygamy only twice throughout the Quran, and in both instances, it only refers to this practice to secure justice for female orphans. Additionally, conditions were placed on the men who could take more than one wife, how many wives they could marry, and under what circumstances they could marry, orphans in. So again, this is it's not just willy-nilly. It's not just like, hey, everybody have as many wives as you want. Everybody gets four wives. It's not like that. That's why it's so important to look at the context around any of the lines in the Quran, because we need to understand like what is it actually talking about. So let's see. Barlas highlights the fact that the Quran says monogamy is always better than polygamy, and that any misunderstandings of this fact stems from a society's pervasive patriarchal thinking. Okay. We have 4, 129 and 33:4, right? Where it also brings this up. So it says, you will not be able to deal equally between your wives, however much you wish to do so. And 33:4 says, Allah hath not assigned unto any man two hearts within his body, right? to give your heart to somebody, that's not something you could just like split up, right? So her final note on that is that it is not an unconditional license for polygamy, and that's important to note. Let's talk about Amina Wadud. She interprets this verse. Wadud takes into consideration the historical context as well, in which it was revealed that it applies. And then she also applies the intertextual reading to the text, focusing specifically on the verse that precedes 4:2, which prohibits guardians from stealing from orphans. Therefore, the proposal of marrying orphans in verse 4:2-3 came as a way to protect these orphans through marriage because of the legal protections they would be entitled to through the institution of marriage. Finally, Wadud applies a third aspect of feminist hermeneutics, citing the lived reality of women today. She asserts that very few women experience justice in polygamous marriages. That is very true. Since the entire basis of the Quran is rooted in justice, it can therefore be argued that the practice of polygamy in modern society should be abolished. So, now my note on that, and this is again, it's just me. This isn't, I'm not speaking for MPB. I'm not speaking for anybody other than myself. This is just me and my experiences in traveling the world and meeting lots of people, right? Is that I don't care so much about if you have two wives as much as the consensual aspect of relationships, right? I have had a few friends in the past who have had sort of a poly household of sorts, right? And it worked really well for them, and everybody was okay. Like everybody was consulted, everybody, it was all consensual. Unfortunately, what happens in modern times, again, why am I limiting it? Throughout time, it's that um men will just be like, I have the right to take a wife, a second wife, a third wife. I'm going to do that. And I don't care if it makes you sad. And I don't care if you approve of it. And it's my right. Don't tell me what to do. That is nowhere in the Quran, right? That is not what we're talking about. And then I have, friends that are like history professors and things like that. If we're going to just completely take our feelings out of this topic and we are just going to look at it like it does here, like we're protecting assets, we're doing all of that. Okay, take your feelings out of it. Okay, biologically, if you have a bunch of wars going on and you're trying to improve like your numbers of your tribe or your people, right? If one guy has multiple wives at the time, it might be seen as helpful and beneficial, right? To keeping like to growing a population. Also in cultures and societies throughout history, they've talked to me and they've noted that, men were the ones that were able to get money. Men were the ones that were able to get jobs. Men were the ones that were able to do this. And if you're in a society where women can't, you know, provide for themselves, I mean, what? It was like the 1970s here in the West when women were finally allowed to have their own bank account without a male to sign off on it. That's very recent. So, uh, if you have the idea here where like a man's role within a polygamous marriage is the ability to have like the financial sort of like guardianship of people who can't provide, like it says here with the orphan thing. That again, I can see where you're trying to make sense there. But if somebody uses that line and is just like, hey, it says I can have all the wives I want, that is not correct. Okay, one more little section here, and then we go to lesson 2, and then we're done. So here we go. So Amina Wadud's also talks about Quran 4:11. God directs you regarding the inheritance of your children. To the male shall be as that is given to two females. If they are only females and more than two, then they will have 2/3 of what is inherited. If there is only one female, then she will have 1/2. And to his parents, each one of them 1/6 of what is inherited. If he has children, if he has no children, and his parents are the heirs, then his parents are the heirs, then to his mother is 1/3. If he has siblings, then to his mother is 1/6. All after a will is carried through or a debt, your parents and your children, you do not know which is closer to you in benefit, a directive from God. God is knowledgeable and wise. So this is another one of those lines that is often used to say women are not worth as much as men. And again, historical context, historical context. Oh my gosh, historical context, right? One of the things to note is that in Islam, if the man is considered to be the financial, um, you know, head of household during this time period when this, was revealed, you know, before in the before times here, you can see where a male heir might, in that context, need, a certain amount of money. But Amina Wadud has a great example here about how it's more about the need of the people and less about the gender. So terms of inheritance distribution, it's not absolute here. So according to Wadud, the truth of the 2-to-1 division model is not absolute because it is one of the many division models provided, right? So it wasn't just like, this is the one and that's the only way to do it. There's like a list. So obviously it can change based on context. And therefore, let's see, 2-to-1 division model is not absolute. And therefore, other models may be used depending on circumstances, right? So circumstantial. Based on her interpretation, Wadud has established 3 terms of inheritance and distribution. So terms of inheritance and distribution are going to be the distribution is intended for living family members, male and female. The entire property can be bequeathed to heirs, and it takes into consideration that the conditions of the heirs and the benefits that the inherited property or assets would give to their heirs. So an example here is that if the children of a deceased man include 1 son and 2 daughters, and 1 son and 1 daughter are very well off, but 1 daughter is caring for the widowed mother, why should she not receive a share greater than the share of the son, right? By granting the second daughter the bigger share of the wealth, we see a practical application of the spirit of justice, which according to Wadud is the core of the Quranic teachings, right? So again, take into the historical context, take into your cultural context, and take into context of who are we talking about and what is their situation and what are we trying to aim at here at the end. Okay. So that is everything that we are covering today as far as the women's rights goes. If you have any questions on that before we move on to the story of Lut, go ahead and type them in the chat right now. Let me know if we have any questions before we move on. I'll give us like 30 seconds on that. Okay. Looks like we're good to move on. Okay. Whew. So this next one is again very controversial because people like to try to use all of this as an excuse to carry out their cruelty. And again, there's a lot to take into consideration. Anytime we take any part of the Quran, any part of it, we have to really do our due diligence here and try to get all of the information before, we make any statements about it. So the story of Lut I've covered in multiple videos in the past. We're going to touch on some different scholarly interpretations here, and sort of like the different way that progressive scholars have come to it, things we need to take into consideration. I'm also going to share with you guys again a little bit of my own personal experience as I went through this, because as a revert, right, and someone who loves to read and then study and take extra college classes for funsies and do all that. When I first came to the lines here about it, I did kind of have that, wait a minute, what? So I'm going to tell you guys about how I worked through understanding this as well. Again, you don't have to take any of my stuff. I am just me. I am just here as an educator, sharing information, take it or leave it. I have no jurisdiction on your life. So we're going to take a look at 3 scholars here. So This is going to be Scott Siraj Kugel. I've covered his stuff pretty extensively. That was the videos that I did previously about his entire like tome that goes over all of this. We went over, I think, like 3 or 4 chapters. Mushin Hendricks, the late Mushin Hendricks. Um, and then we have Kesha Ali, so Dr. Ali. So she is a professor with PhDs in like religious studies and all these great things. So we're gonna hear what she has to say too. So first of all, let's take a look at the three main sections here really quick that you see in the Quran when you learn about the story of Lut. You come upon them and this is what you see. So Quran 7:80 through 84, we have and Lot when he said to his people, quote, "Do you commit lewdness to an extent that none in the worlds had surpassed you? You come to men with desire instead of women. You are a transgressing people." End quote. The only response of his people was, quote, "Drive them out of your town. They are a people who wish to be pure." End quote. We saved him and his family except for his wife. She was one of those who lagged behind. We showered them with a shower. So see what the punishment for the criminals was. We also have Quran 11:77 through 83. I'm not going to read all of these because, again, these are kind of long, but you guys have seen these. It's going to be talking about when the messengers came to Lot, read their account. He said, "My people, these are my daughters." We're going to talk about that as well. Like, why is he offering his daughter? Let's talk about that too. But he's like, "These are my daughters. You should take my daughters," right? They are pure for you, so be aware of God and do not disgrace me regarding my guests. Is there no reasonable man among you? And they said, "You know we have no interest in your daughters, and you are aware of what we want." He said, "If only I had strength against you, or I could find myself some powerful support." And then, they show that they're, the angels of God. Don't worry about it. God's got this. You need to leave your family. So when our command came, we turned it upside down and we raised it. Fire, brimstone, flipping over cities, etc. And then the final section is going to be in Quran 26, 160 through 175. So the people of Lot denied the messengers, for their brother Lot said to them, "Will you not be righteous? I am to you a trustworthy messenger, so be aware of God and obey me. Do not ask you for a wage, for my reward is upon the Lord of the worlds. You approach the males of our worlds. You leave them with your Lord. You leave what your Lord has created for you of mates. You are an intrusive people," they said. "If you do not cease, Ola, you will be among those driven out." There's the anger and the leaving and the God's wrath, all 3 sections. Okay. I cited the verses. Feel free to go and read them. They get kind of lengthy. And I do want us to get to the interpretations here. So go read your Quran if you need it. I showed this in my other videos and I'm going to show it again. If you want a more descriptive version of the story of the Prophet Lut, Stories of the Prophets by Ibn Kathir is great. It is 14th century. This is used by scholars, and it specifically tells you the line by line description of the story of Lut and what happened. I will note that it is violent. So if you have any like triggers there, note that there. So what do scholars say? So first of all, Kugel, who we've talked about previously, he interprets the Quran and Islam through the lens of liberation theology. So liberation theology and those who subscribe to this theology insist that the key principle of the Quran is to strive for justice and solidarity with the oppressed people. Kugel asserts that the story of Lut, like other verses in the Quran, cannot be read in isolation, meaning individuals must use intertextuality and understanding the Quran by considering the entire content and the content of the text. So He goes through the two different types of readings that you use with liberation theology we talked about previously, including a semantic reading and a thematic reading. So semantic reading is going to be talking about the words and the words within the context of the piece, all of the words surrounding it and the piece as a whole. And then the thematic reading is looking at the bigger picture, like what is the theme? What is the point? Um, and the example I always like to throw out is, like if you're going to look back at fairy tales or like fables or anything like that, and you do Little Red Riding Hood and everybody reads it, and then the people come out at the other end and they're like, so what I got is we need to kill all the wolves. And you're like, you missed the whole point. That's what thematic readings are there for, is it's like, okay, like what are we actually talking about here? What is the theme, the topic, the greater message, right, that we're talking about? So Kugel identifies three keywords, specifically desire, abomination, and transgressions. So while some scholars read these words in the various verses and interpret them as referring to homosexuality, Kugel references the other times in which those words appear throughout the Quran in the context that have nothing to do with sexuality. Kugel reminds readers that the men of Sodom had wives and identified as heterosexual, concluding that the men raped the male visitors not because they sexually desired them, but because rape was a way for them to assert their power over vulnerable people. We talked about that in some of those previous videos as well, that this is a very violent story, banging down doors, grabbing people, forcing it's an essay story. So and he does refer to like, but you have wives, why are you doing this? Right. So obviously it had nothing to do with like sexuality. This is not this is not a love story. This is not like two guys fell in love and they got married and then God killed the whole town. It's again, that is not the context. So lessons from the reading he notes are that it follows the example of the Prophet Lut to be generous and protect vulnerable people, avoid adultery, avoid greed and stinginess, condemning sexual violence, upholding their respective relationships based on mutual support and love for one another. It says that he notes that they were punished because of the wider immorality in the community, including the network of idolatry and exploitation, which the entire community, both men and women, participated in. Finally, Kugel's analysis applies a thematic reading of the Quran, which to him demonstrates that the main purpose of the story was to detail the consequences of individuals who had rejected their prophets as a warning to those of the time. It's also important to note that I did talk about in the previous video, part of Kugel's research, one of his chapters points out the fact that Lut, it was not the final prophet, he was a previous prophet, and if you follow the teachings of Islam, they say that you are supposed to follow the prophet of your time, right? Which is why Muslims, don't follow like Judaism, right? Because we're talking about previous prophets, and Muslims follow the final revelation of the Prophet Muhammad. So it wouldn't really make sense to go back to a previous prophet and then try to grab all of that, even if your interpretation is different than the progressive interpretation. It's still a previous prophet at the end of the day. So I thought that note that he made in that chapter is also really interesting. So go look at his research. It's really interesting, honestly. He takes it from a lot of different angles. So Mushin Hendricks, who was unfortunately murdered recently. I do have a video talking about him a little bit, if you want to go see that one too. But he was a great scholar on this stuff. Let's take a look at what his interpretations say. So Hendricks looks at the context of the Quran, as well as the history of the city of Sodom, a wealthy city that was well traveled to by individuals across the region. Hendricks also examines Islamic history, particularly the story of the Prophet Ibrahim, who was the uncle of the Prophet Lut. According to Hendricks' understanding of these histories, it was divine law for believers and those who followed the way of the prophets to honor visitors and be hospitable to travelers. However, the people of Sodom were stingy and selfish travelers, violating the divine law. Hendricks asserts that the sex acts referenced in the story were rape and had little to do with sexual gratification and more to do with the need to dominate others. Because at the time, rape was a way to assert male dominance over oppressed people. And I'm going to get to that in a minute. That is not just in the olden days. That is a thing that happens nowadays too. Human Rights Watch has, articles and articles on that. So I've seen hints of that in some of the cultures that I have spent time around in the last few years. So I'll talk about that a little bit as well. But yeah, this isn't a sexuality thing, is what he's pointing out here. And we're also going to talk about why does it bring up the daughters. That's going to come up in just a minute too, because that is an eyebrow raiser there for sure. The first time you read that, if you haven't read any of the contextualizations, you're like, why is he giving what? Who offers their daughter to a bunch of like angry people banging down a door to assault people? So we're going to talk about that too. So Hendricks places particular emphasis on the practice of temple prostitution. So here's part of that. So the people of Sodom were not monotheistic, pointing that out. Okay. So they had their own culture, their own beliefs, and their own, norms as far as how you go about things. So one of those is that temple prostitution was a thing where fathers offered their virgin daughters as the temple of Ishtar to be raped by strangers as an offering to the god Ishtar to purify the virgin daughters and prepare them for marriage. So there's that. I'm also going to be talking about sort of the concept of marital rape here in a minute. Again, I'm sorry, some of this is pretty extreme. So if that, if it's too triggering, I apologize in advance. This story is rough. But yeah, so this was like a cultural thing there. So the context of the time period, non-consensual sex or rape was a tool used to dominate vulnerable people, not as a way of expressing one's sexuality and sexual orientation. It is not what we're talking about when we talk about like modern sexuality. We're talking about the context of like power dynamics. So final thing from Hendricks is that based on his analysis, he cites 5 reasons why the people of Sodom were destroyed by God. They were polytheists whose idolatrous beliefs encouraged social injustice and sexual promiscuity. Number 2, their inhospitality to guests indicated their racism, xenophobia, and social discrimination. Number 3, robberies on the highway, committing the sin of thievery and stealing. Number 4, exercised coercion and dominance through sexual acts. And number 5, their unjust laws were indicative of a society run by patriarchal elites. So there's a lot going on there. Again, in no way could you contextualize 2 guys fell in love and got married and God killed the whole town. That is nowhere near the context of the story of Lut, just so we're aware of that. Finally, last scholar on this. We have Kesha Ali. So she is a doctor, actually, a PhD in religion, world religions. So the need to acknowledge complexity within Islamic tradition, the need to take responsibility for one's interpretive choices, and then the need to take theological considerations seriously. These are 3 things that she really strongly believes. Those are the 3 things that Dr. Ali really focuses on here, is the need to acknowledge the complexity within Islamic tradition, need to take responsibility for one's interpretive choices, and then the need to take theological considerations seriously. So let's see. And applying these 3 considerations to the story of Lut, Ali disputes Hendricks and Kugel's arguments that the story is one of consent and rape, because that argument rests on whether the Quran consent is necessary or for ethical and or lawful sexual relationships. In particular, Ali highlights that the Prophet Lut offered his daughters to the men of Sodom at the temple of Ishtar, and that elsewhere in the Quran, consent was not always necessary for what the Quran considered illicit sexual relations, especially as it pertained to female captives. So she actually disagrees with both of them and their interpretations. Although Ali disputes Hendricks and Kugel's argument, she does not interpret the story of Lut as one that condemns same-sex acts. Instead, Ali highlights the use of the term preference in the verses. She posits that one way to interpret the condemnation of men who approach men in preference to those who God created to be their mates is because these men would otherwise be choosing female mates, but are having sex with other men and are therefore going against their individual nature and preferences, right? So, like, if these are heterosexual dudes, why are they doing this? And that is what she has to say about that. I did want to make a quick note. This is the last thing I want to say on that about the offering up of the daughters, the things that are said about men, lusting after other men, the thing about just all that. I want to clear up a few things. This is in my own studies and own research. Again, take it or leave it. You don't have to take it. That's fine. But first things first, I want to note the why offer up the daughters thing, and the importance of why is it not condemning rape specifically? Why is it, why is he saying that this non-consensual, not non-consensual sexual relationship is okay if it's like on women but not on men, right? That's kind of something that comes up. I do want to note that those quotes were not from God, in that it's not God saying it. They're literally quotes saying like like Lut said, the prophet said, quote this stuff. And I found that interesting because he is a man of his time. We talk about this when we talk about trying to understand the stories of the prophets, right? One of the amazing things about Islam is that our prophets are human and our prophets are people. This isn't like Christianity where we believe that the prophets themselves are half God or pure divine, right? So that they were people. When we look at, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, when the angel Jibril first came to him, his reaction was extremely human. That's one of the things I love about his story is that he freaked out, right? He saw an angel and he like ran down the mountain and he thought he was like losing his mind. That's a very human reaction to something like that. And when I think about the fact that for example, here in the West, where we are considered to be very liberal and very like, all that, that it wasn't until July of 1993 that marital rape became illegal in all 50 states. That's like a little over 30 years ago. Not a century ago, not 500 years ago, definitely not over 1400 years ago, very recently. And I have actually run into scholars, like Islamic scholars that I've been talking to, and I had one roll his eyes at me when I talked about marital rape one time because he was like, "Oh, you believe in marital?" And I'm like, "Yes, I do, actually." So the fact that we have people now, just now in the 21st century, who still don't think that marital rape is a big deal, it would be very easy to note that people at that time didn't think that that was a problem. So if the Prophet Lut is put in this position and he's scared and this is dangerous, and literally the only context that he really has to pull from in his own life and in his own society is like, I don't know, like, do you need another wife? Like, I don't, he's in my mind, that is something that I could see happening for sure. Um, and then it's also another thing I think about, this is the last note I want to make, is that the Quran, when it talks about some of these things, like, the better treatment of slaves, or bringing up this story where, these men are, attacking other men, which isn't very common throughout history and is really only done in these really strict power dynamics, patriarchal societies. You can see it nowadays in the studies usually show it within like prison systems. And it can even be like officers on inmates or inmates on inmates. So this is going to be extremely patriarchal, violent, aggressive groups. And it is a way that they assert dominance, which is very close to the context within the story. But when I look at some of the more considered controversial topics within the Quran, where it talks about maybe there's a better way to do this. Maybe we should take a look at this and how bad that thing that you were doing was. But it doesn't outright make a list of all of the things that we should or shouldn't be doing. Um, I looked at the verses where it says to look towards nature, like if, you look to the birds in the sky and the plants and all of that, then in there are um, signs for those who understand. And one of those signs, we learn as progressive Muslims is evolution and the evolution of any species, the evolution of, plants and animals and the evolution of people. And I see the Quran as a catalyst of spiritual growth and enlightenment, but that it's starts to plant the seeds of what we should be thinking about and looking at and how to become more moral, better people and get us there and evolve ourselves there. Just because God comes out and says, you should do this and you shouldn't do that, right? It doesn't automatically create change. So when I look at some of the stories of the prophets, right, that we need to reflect on, I think to me, they're there partially for our own evolution, so that as we go through time, as our cultures evolve, as people evolve, as all of that, we can still continue to look back. And now that we have this new information and now that we have this new perspective, we can take those thematic readings and we can say, oh, right, like, oh, that's what we're talking about. And so as a literature major, right, somebody that spent a lot of time and still spends a lot of time doing rhetorical analysis and literary analysis, I love how older texts throughout time get reinterpreted and revived and like understood in a new way because the people evolve through it and now can get more information than they were able to get previously. So that is another note on that. Um, all right, so that is the end of tonight's class. For those of you who are watching on YouTube later, don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you're looking for a progressive place to put that zakat money, Muslims for Progressive Values is a great place to do that. For more information on us, go ahead and go to mpvusa.org. And we also just came out with a publishing arm. If you're interested in publishing a book that's either progressive Islam or really any progressive theme, including novels, short stories, memoirs, poetry, and more. Hope to see you in the next video. Inshallah. I will see you later.